Hey there, I am super excited. Today I have a new success interview from my Unleash Your Greatness Within podcast. It was my privilege to interview Krister Ungerböck.
You already know. My passion and my mission to help you unleash your greatness within. My heart goes out to the underdogs that's on their way. If you think you can go from good to great, okay, let's motivate. GreatnessWithin.com. TJ Hoisington. GreatnessWithin.com.
You see, it was great to have Krister on the Unleash Your Greatness Within podcast. And if you have followed my podcast for any length of time, you know that I only bring you the top of the top. We're talking best-selling authors, thought leaders, CEOs, professional athletes, and celebrities. And today was no different, as it was my privilege to interview Krister, who is the author of this new book titled 22 Talk Shifts, Tools to Transform Leadership in Business, in Partnership, and in Life. And let me tell you something, we went through this book and we talked about it, but let me give you a little bit of the backstory. You see, Krister was the CEO of one of the largest family-owned software companies in the world. When he started, it was just a few people, and as CEO, he grew it over 3,000%. But through that process, and through his relationship with his dad, wow, he learned some painful lessons, but he also learned how to succeed. And together, he's written this book that can make a difference in your leadership ability and also your life. And I want you to hear the interview. So before we jump into it, just a quick reminder, if you're watching this on my YouTube channel, then I invite you to subscribe and make sure you click that notification bell so that you're the first to be notified when I come out with a new motivational message or success interview like this. And if you follow me on Apple Podcast or Stitcher or Spotify or one of the other platforms, hey, thanks for being a part of my community. Okay, without any further ado, let's jump right into this interview. Krister, welcome to the Unleash Your Greatness Within podcast.
I'm happy to be here, TJ. I want to know, are you going to unleash my greatness or am I here to unleash your greatness?
I'm hoping you can unleash my greatness with your content and everyone listening, all right? Because I have read your book. I've gone through it. There's a lot of actionable ideas in the book that are useful, like literally fill in the blank. So I don't want to get ahead of myself right now, but let's start off, Krister. It's great to have you on the show, but why don't you share with us, the audience, a little bit of your backstory?
Yeah, so I was a CEO of one of the largest family-owned software companies in the world, and about 4 years ago, I found myself at the YMCA signing up for a gym membership, and the woman asked me, "Who is your emergency contact?" And I broke down crying, and in that moment, I had no one. And what I realized is, so in the 2 weeks prior to that moment, I had walked out on the CEO job of the company that I'd helped build and loved. I mean, we built $100 million in shareholder value, 3,000% growth, employee engagement awards, all the good stuff. And by all definitions, people would say, well, that must be a good leader, right? You know, all this financial success. And then 2 weeks later, my wife walked out on me and I literally had no one. And so I looked and so it was a family-owned business, and I had gone to my business partners and essentially I said, hey, you know, this is kind of getting ridiculous. And, you know, I felt like I was trying to be CEO with my hands tied behind my back, or at least one hand tied behind my back. And my business partners were my family members, my father and my 3 brothers. And I said, hey, here's my vision for where I want to take the company. I want to build $1 billion company in my life. You're going to have some good financial benefit out of that. And they just declined. And I said, well, if I had basically the 30 years of conflict with my father, who was the founding shareholder of the company, and we just couldn't get it. And I could see that we weren't going to be able to continue the trajectory of 20 to 30% growth that we'd been on for the kind of 10, 15 years before that. Mm-hmm. And so I said, the only way is really to kind of, you know, for me to buy the controlling share. And I just said, name your price. I'm not going to negotiate with you. You know, let's just figure it out. And he came back 24 hours later and said, you know, there's really no price at which I'd sell you the controlling share of the business. And so I resigned and said, it's time for me to move on and do something else. And I don't know if you've ever tried to make a decision with family members, but I remember one time we were trying to decide how to get the family to Colorado for a ski vacation. Uh-huh. And, we got 9 adults and 6 young kids. Should we take an RV? Should we fly? How are we going to get there? Right. And literally it was 12 days and 38 spreadsheets. And, later the decision was everybody just do whatever you want. It was basically no decision. Right. Right. And that was kind of how I felt running this company. And if you can imagine the frustration of being a leader and trying to herd cats. But when I realized that, 2 weeks later, my wife walked out on me, and I realized, so who's the common denominator here? Right. There's only one person that everyone's wanting to break up with. So I I'd started reading business books when I was 12 years old. I'd probably read hundreds of business books before I even, went to college. And I set all the business books aside, and I just went, I hung out with a lot of kind of new age people from California. And I was I'm going to immerse myself in all those ideas that I would have judged as far out or kind of new age back when I was a CEO. And because clearly all these business books had gotten me to be a leader with no followers, right? And
which, by the way, is a great distinction right there. That a leader implies you have followers. There are so many voices in the world. If you're a leader, are people following you? And I don't mean following as from a blind place, not blind followers. We're talking about supporters of your vision, supporters of your values, and so forth. Are they following? Are they influencers? Anyways, sorry to cut you off there, but I think that's.
And cool. I think to your point, one of the things I noticed is as a CEO, everybody's you got to cast a vision that people want to follow. 100%. We're going to change the world, or Steve Jobs said, put a dent in the universe, right?
That's right.
And so my vision was always to create this $1 billion company in my lifetime. And people, what I realized through this journey is people were following the vision, but they weren't following me. And the leaders who truly change the world are the ones who are not only have a vision that people want to follow, but they have a leadership style and a personal connection with people that people want to follow that person. And admittedly, I was just never that person. And we achieved an amazing success off of just this back of this great business execution and strategy and vision. But ultimately, it all kind of fell apart, right? And so I, again, set aside all those business books, and I just looked outside because I was, what's the secret that I've been missing? And because of the marital divorce, I was kind of reading a lot of stuff about divorce and relationships. And I stumbled upon the work of Dr. John Gottman, who's many of your listeners will know that he's the world-renowned researcher on divorce, able to predict divorce with 94% accuracy based on a 20-minute conversation. And he looks for 4 specific communication patterns. And what blew me away is that those 4 communication patterns would have predicted every single business divorce in my entire career. Executives I'd fired, salespeople who went away, taking customers to the competition. And so I was like, well, what if there's these principles outside of the business world that we could take from outside and bring them to create much better leaders?
100%.
And that was really kind of my mission. And in writing this book, Talk Shifts.
Yeah, Talk Shifts. Here's the book. There's one thing I've been teaching for a lot of years, that principles are principles and people are people. And if you want better leaders, you got to create better people, or people have to want to be better, right? Sometimes leaders are like, no, this is how I am as a leader. And when it doesn't match with the person, it's short-lived. It's temporary. And so you've got to align those. This, you've seen me, I don't know, you probably know in your background, there have been times where I've gone out to dinner with an executive, kindest conversation ever, positive, compassionate, all those things. But here's what I know. When I'm working inside the walls of the company, nobody else sees that person that way.
Yeah.
And I say, you cannot turn off your brain at the door. You can't turn off your heart at the door. You got to be that same person you were at the meal as you are working with your people. And you know what? The truth is, people aren't getting that in many respects. And you just look at the culture. We're speaking of the United States. I'm speaking of the United States right now. There is a need for that. that more,
Yeah.
we'll get into the compassion side in a second, but you did right here. Like many business leaders, I was laser focused on achieving success. I began reading business books as a teenager because I wanted to make my father proud. Ultimately, it wasn't in the business books that I would find the secrets that I was seeking. I went to workshops where I learned the insights that, frankly, I would have dismissed as touchy-feely and woohoo psychobabble back in my CEO days. And it was there that I discovered the secrets that had eluded me all those years as a CEO. That, to me, that is truth that you are speaking right there. Explain that a little bit, the soft skill versus the hard skill, that the soft skills really are the hard skills. Go ahead.
Yeah. So as a leader, I was one of those people who I never knew the names of the kids of people. And I never really talked about the relationship. I was always the hard driving, aggressive leader. And it's interesting. People who probably read the book be like, whoa, I don't get that from you. And what I intended to do with the book was really to give specific, fill in the blanks, practical phrases that people like me who are kind of engineering, I want a recipe for emotional intelligence. I'd read Daniel Goleman and all that. And I thought I was being emotional intelligent, but I didn't have a language to do it. And as you said, those compassionate leaders who you have dinner with, if the reality is, they say like actions speak louder than words, but the reality is actions don't speak, words do. And so how are people, for the most part, going to judge whether I'm compassionate? And my words are the easiest way to convey that. And so what I found is that my heart was in the right place, but my words were not. And I was just that kind of aggressive, like, show me the results. And another thing I didn't include in the book, which actually came afterwards, is, so I was in these kind of new age rooms doing a lot of, it's funny, like a lot of the CEOs I hang out with, I tell them some of the stuff that I do, and they're like, why would you ever do that? I would never do that. And I'm like, well, that's like one of like 20 or 30 crazy things that I've done. Like, I think in 2 or 3 weeks, I'm gonna go to San Diego and take some kind of frog poison and I don't know, like puke my guts out for an hour. So anyway, like that's just one of but what I find in all these experiences is that my role is to try to go into these kind of somewhat weird experiences and how can I pull some leadership insight and trying to translate it into kind of something I never would have gotten from the Harvard Business Review, right? Which is where I would find all my ideas, when I was CEO. And so one of the people I met actually that I didn't write about in the book was there was this couple of, I was often the only person with a sport coat on in these rooms, a lot of therapists and a lot of kind of, very new age folks. And there was this couple that was between the two of them, they were marriage counselors, man and wife. And between the two of them, they had like 75 or 80 years of marriage counseling. And I said, I need to hear, like, what is it that women say on your couch over and over and over again, over 40 years each of like marriage counseling? And the woman told me, and I remember saying that, saying, what's crazy is that 4 out of those 5 statements, you could take the word husband out and you could put boss in, and it's the exact same thing that people who are frustrated with their boss would say. So it kind of got like, what if the things that make happier employees, the behaviors and the words, can also make for happier wives as well? And that was kind of one of the principles of the broader purpose of the book was my mission is to use leadership education and business communication as a tool to transform 10 million marriages, leaders, and lives. And so I was one of those business leaders that I never read any relationship books. And then by the time my wife said, hey, I'm out, I was like, oh, I'll read some. And she's like, well, no, I'm out.
Yeah, it's too late.
Yeah. Well, and so the reality is so many men and successful kind of, especially professionals, will read like 20 or 30 business books before we'd read anything about parenting or relationships. So how can we meet men where they are, giving them tools to be better in their careers and better, more successful individuals? And oh, by the way, that's just the spoonful of sugar that, kind of coats these same tools in a slightly different format that you can use to be a better father, mother, husband, or wife.
And I think those principles, there's primary greatness and there is secondary greatness. Primary greatness are those fundamental principles, qualities, relationships. What kind of parent are you? What kind of community member are you? How are you as a person? The secondary greatness are going to be the accolades, are going to be the titles and so forth. And Stephen Covey talked a lot about this when he was alive, about the primary greatness versus the secondary greatness. And secondary greatness are the things, the titles, the authority.
Yeah.
But I agree with you. If you can apply these fundamental principles of kindness, of compassion as a leader, you will get more respect and have more influence with your people than putting on this hat of a leader, and this is how a leader is supposed to be. No, you know this, and you've learned this, and I know, having worked with a lot of leaders, the ones that are most effective are the ones that love their people, treat them with respect, speak from their heart, if you will. But I also don't want to throw out the baby with the bathwater. Your drive as a CEO to achieve this audacious goal that you had, you can't say that none of that had value. It did have value. So it's a constant balance between the results and the compassion. The results and the compassion. Any thoughts on that?
Well, admittedly, I was 99% results and 1% compassion. And that was ultimately what, maybe 80-20. But, I needed to be more like 60-40.
Exactly.
You mentioned Stephen Covey. So interestingly, that was when I was 19 years old, I read the 7 Habits of Highly Effective People. And that was, he said, begin with the end in mind. I wrote my personal mission statement. And that was where this vision of, I want to build $1 billion company in my life.
Awesome.
I just come off of reading like Wayne Huizenga's book. And I was like, well, if this guy built 2 or $3 billion companies, certainly I could build one, right?
That's awesome.
Which I guess that's how a 19-year-old feels, but thinks. But I feel like one of the things that was really a challenge for me is like, I not only, because that was my defining vision, and I love the 7 Habits and Stephen Covey's work is, but when my life fell apart, I didn't just lose my job, my spouse. I also lost my identity, because my identity was, I'm going to be the person who's going to build $1 billion company in my life. And I literally repeated that mantra since age 19 for 25 years before I finally retired as CEO. And, so it was really, it was more than just kind of recreating my life. It was really recreating my identity.
Did I read later in the book, correct me if I'm wrong, but did I read later in the book that you and your dad worked out your differences later on?
Yeah, we did. And that was, so I joke that say, why write 5 books when you can rewrite one 5 times?
Oh yeah.
So I think I wrote the first version of this book and it was terrible, like 4 years ago, and second version 3 years ago. So not the version that was finally published, but the one immediately prior, I actually read to my father. It was going to be published a year ago. And I read it to him because there were some difficult stories about him and I in there. Now, there's still some difficult stories as you read it.
Just a few, you allude to them,
Well, there was even more difficult ones in the previous version, but we'll save that for the second book. So I read it to him because I said, I'm not going to publish anything that you're not going to agree with. I also asked my ex-wife to read it as well, because there was in that version, there were some stories about her. I didn't want to write a book to hurt them, right?
That's right.
And my father's eyesight is not great, so I couldn't just give him the book. I actually read it aloud to him, face to face. And we talked about it as we went through. It was, 3 or 4 days of 3 or 4 hours each, because with all the conversations over the course of about 4 weeks. And about 2/3 of the way through the book, he said, I had no idea how my words hurt you. And so here he's 75 years old. And I just there was a part of me that was like, wow, I'm so happy that I learned at age 42 how my words were hurting people. Because can you imagine going to age 70 or 75 and then realizing that you've been basically living your entire life with the toilet paper on your shoe and hurting people around you?
100%. Yeah.
And
you actually talk about in the book that, what is it, 90? I have it on my document, but 90% or 85 or 95% of the people are not Harvard came out with some research that
Oh,
said
yeah,
we're
yeah.
not aware of
Yes.
how our interaction, our words are impacting other
Yeah.
people. And one of the goals is to become more self-aware. Anyway,
Yeah,
sorry
95, according to Harvard Business Review, 95% of people think they're self-aware and only 10 to 15% are. And I was one of those people as well. I thought I was really self-aware, but interestingly, our words is actually probably one of the things that we're least aware of. I had a unique opportunity, and some of this is kind of built into the concept of the book, to learn to lead in French and German as an adult. I opened businesses in France and Germany. And so language was really present for me kind of as an adult and as a leader. And the interesting thing is, even though it was very a conscious effort to learn to lead in two new languages, I never actually applied many of those lessons back to English until after this whole thing fell apart, because language is so unconscious. And so in any case, I think that, what happens is my father is actually Austrian. So, his language, German, is a very harsh language generally.
Okay. Right.
And so that was a factor, certainly, in him not realizing how strong his words were perceived by myself and maybe others. So there was also some family history that went into that as well. But what inspired me to kind of rewrite the book one last time was two stories. One, I shared the book with two people. I had about 100 beta readers of the last version about 18 months ago.
Good.
And one guy, this French guy, I'd never met him. And because he was in a writing group, I was like, give me harsh feedback. Call my baby ugly, please. I dare you.
Yep.
And he sent me his feedback and he said, Krister, and I really thought it was like, wow, this dude's just angry. He just like gave me some super harsh feedback. And he's like, let me call you. I want to talk to you on the phone. Took me through his harsh feedback for about 15 minutes. And then he said something that literally I started like to tear up. He said, Krister, I want to tell you, I've read thousands of books. He's a university professor or something. I've read thousands of books and this is the best book I've read in my entire life. And I literally was like, I don't know if I said a 4-letter word and I was like, I felt like I was holding on to something. I knew it wasn't really as well written as I wanted to. And so I was like, I got to go back to the drawing board. That was the version I read to my father. And what I realized, the act of experiencing the book together with my father, where, so what I did is I hired a 10-time New York Times bestselling writer to help coach me, and an editor who's been behind over 100 New York Times bestsellers. And we basically rewrote the book from the ground up to be a framework for two people. Could be a boss and an employee, a husband and a wife, a father and a son, mother and a daughter, to transform their relationship. And the book was kind of like one way to do it, but what I was really I'm most excited about is we actually did a video book. So the intention is, like, the reality is most people are probably not going to sit there and read the book to their father or their spouse out loud. Most people aren't patient enough to do that. But would you pop it on your television and watch it together as a family?
Mm-hmm.
So my vision was what if you've got teenage kids or 20-year-olds and you sit down and you watch this book and talk about it as a family to give everyone in the family a whole new way of communicating. Mm. And that for me is kind of, let's say, what I'm most excited about, the millions of, hopefully thousands or hundreds of thousands of lives that we can transform with these new tools.
100%. And you know what? These tools are very practical.
Yeah.
They are real. And I'm on page, one of the pages was toward the end of the book, page 180 to 181. I mean, just simple things that you give in here, tools for changing out, emotional words for other words and communicating from, you just got to go to the book. You say there's always a way to identify false feelings. They almost always complete the sentence with you, blank, right? Whatever that is, you and me. It ends with me. You, me. Anyway.
So what that would be is if I said to you, I feel ignored, right? If I said you ignored me, ignored's not really a feeling, right? When I say you ignored me, I feel ignored, I'm basically saying, TJ, you ignored me. I'm kind of blaming you, right?
Right, that's right.
But I'm fooling myself into thinking that I'm talking about my emotions, right? I'm connecting with you by saying you ignored me.
Right, exactly. No, that's a great.
I feel ignored by you.
Yeah, I feel ignored by you.
Whenever we talk about our feelings, and this is something I didn't find anywhere in any of the emotional intelligence research, or books written is there's only 3 words to talk about our feelings. And the first 2 are the same. I feel, and the third is a blank. Sad, happy, angry, blah, 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 blah. But if you say, I feel like, we're talking about our thoughts. I feel that you did that on purpose. It's a thought. And so what happens in English is we can actually fool ourselves into think that we're talking about our emotions, but we're not. And if you look in other languages like German and French and many other languages, you don't find the word. So in French, the word for to feel is sentir.
Okay.
And you look up in a thesaurus, you don't see penser, which is the word to think in a French thesaurus. You do in English. You don't see it in German.
So you're totally separating the thoughts from the feelings. 2 totally
and so
different things.
there's some little things that like our language as English speakers actually gets in the way or fools us, if you will, into thinking that we're talking about our emotions. And that was one of the things that really, for many years, I would start to use the word feel. I mean, I was CEO, so it was my culture. So I could be like, I could talk about my feelings if I wanted.
Right.
Some corporate cultures, you can't use the word feel. And that's why in the book, I give some examples to say, well, if in your corporate culture, your boss is like, I don't like to hear you say, I feel, then you can just say, I am sad. And that was kind of like taking some of those new age words. I love what I found there, but I was like, you can't say, if I can't go into my boss in corporate America and say that. And I was like, well, how could we take the same concept and translate it into a fill in the blanks phrase that would work in corporate America? And I think that was, at least as it relates to feelings and emotional intelligence and emotional connection, I think that's one of the things that those 3 or 4 chapters towards the end of the book really adds to the emotional intelligence.
And it really does. And I love how you lay out specific phrases that are common that we use, and you suggest a replacement. Say it this way and see what will happen to your relationship. I love that. Okay, so let's talk. I want to go backwards just a little bit. You call it the compassion revolution. You say the compassion revolution has begun. I agree with you. In fact, in my world, when we talk about leadership with compassion, I call it dignified leadership. Yeah. It's caring for the people, not just the result. Yeah. Right. And when I wrote the book, The Secret of the Slight Edge with Bob Mowad, one of the grandfathers in the personal development industry, he would always emphasize the idea, reward the effort, not just the end result. Yes. Because in between the starting line and the finish line, there's a lot of play there that can make the difference in people's lives and whether or not they give their very best. Any thoughts about that?
Well, I can say one of the reasons that I never while I was CEO, one of the things that led to my downfall, if you would call it that, was that I never rewarded the effort. I only rewarded the end result. And that's probably one of my biggest learnings. And you read it. There is a chapter about specifically that, where I talk about that. And this compassion revolution, like I would have never considered myself a compassionate leader when I was CEO. But I do think this is kind of like probably the closest word to kind of encapsulate this like emotional intelligence, but also like, being able to kind of walk the line between kind of firm leadership, but also kind of being able to connect emotionally with people who work with us. And there was, I feel so like somebody's been watching over me, because this book was actually, the manuscript was supposed to be done about a week before COVID hit. And so because of that, things got delayed, or actually was delayed not because of COVID, it was delayed for some other reasons. And despite all the frustration with the book being delayed, it's actually probably 2 weeks after the manuscript was supposed to be done, I found myself on this Zoom call with an executive team that I was coaching. And a little 10-year-old boy popped into the Zoom window and asked the VP of operations, can I have a hug? And the whole call softened, like, of course now we see that all the time, but this is like in the early weeks of, the quarantine. And it just struck me. I said, would this have been okay like a year ago? And I'm sure you've seen as well, like executives who were like me, were probably really hard leaders, have for the first time really opened up. I talked to a group of CIOs of big companies. I was facilitating a panel discussion, and one of the guys is like, I cried in front of like 500 of my employees on a Zoom. I'm like, wow, would that have happened in 2019?
Yeah.
And so the actual inscription to the book that came to me, that like I was really like, I said, I dedicated it to COVID-19. Like, despite all the devastation that you've wrought, the silver lining is that you may have ushered in the compassion revolution in business. And I think that there's employees these days are deciding whether they're going to leave or stay with your company, a year or two from now, whenever they're able to find a better job, based on the behavior of our leaders right now.
That's right.
Right.
That's right.
And I think that that's really going to differentiate the companies that are able to retain and really get the most out of employees.
I think so. So for every hard driving CEO that's listening to this right now, that's great, but too much of something is not great. For example, you talk about the folly of focusing on strengths. I'm a huge believer. And when I work with my clients, by the way, I'll say a little side note, there are times with CEOs, CFOs, COOs, where I do pull them aside and say, look at how I just noticed you do this. Look how that could potentially come across to someone. And we actually run assessments as well, where we can actually measure people's traits and how people relate to those. And let me tell you, they are breakthrough ideas for these leaders that never saw that in themselves. And then when I meet with the managers and the supervisors that are underneath the leader, to be able to take that data back, and it's so it's so humbling. The point is, we could skip all that if you could just be human. If you could be willing to show a little bit more emotion and not take away the drive for excellence. We've got to have that as leadership, but there's a balance there. And so when you talk about the folly of focusing on your strengths, what I'm hearing you say is it can get out of balance, right? Too much of one thing is not a good thing.
And I think that like the strengths finder and strengths movement is, like I believe as a leader, it's really important to try to focus on the strengths of the people rather than their weaknesses. The folly of focus on our strengths is when we apply it to ourselves. Like, I'm just going to focus on my strengths.
Yep.
Like, well, no. When it comes to ourselves, we have to neutralize our weaknesses. It's our responsibility, not our boss's responsibility to neutralize our weaknesses. And so admittedly, I think that kind of focus on our strengths. I see a lot of people, like I'm kind of ADHD sometimes. A lot of entrepreneurs are, and they kind of wear ADHD like a badge on their sleeve. Like, I'm ADHD, I'm a CEO. And it's like, well, that doesn't mean that it's like something that's making you successful.
Right.
And what I see is these are not languages that you do one or the other. It's just, if 9 times out of 10 your language is criticism, then like let's go like 4 out of 10 or 6 out of 10.
Exactly.
Even going from 9 out of 10 to 8 out of 10 or whatever, 1 out of 10 for the softer language to 2, like that's already 100% improvement.
Yes.
And many leaders, especially those, I don't know if this is unique to tech, but I grew up like Steve Jobs, Bill Gates, Larry Ellison. These were guys all like really, really tough leaders. That was like this is how you get ahead in business, right? And I wrote an article a number of years ago in Quartz magazine about Steve Jobs, about how his autobiography was probably one of the worst things that happened in tech, because it gave all these young entrepreneurs, tech entrepreneurs, like, oh, well, that's the reason I'm a jerk, is because it made Steve Jobs successful.
That's right.
But what most people don't realize is that Steve Jobs, who invented the iPhone, was not the Steve Jobs who fired people in elevators. The Steve Jobs who fired people in elevators was fired himself from Apple in 1997. Right. And he rose from the ashes of his former self and came back a different individual, according to Ed Catmull, the man who worked with him for longer than ever. He said, Steve Jobs that I knew and worked with for 20 years, he changed a lot after he got married and had kids, and he was not the person who fired people in elevators. Yet the press has all those 20-something and 30-something entrepreneurs, myself included, believing that that's how we got successful.
No, but I remember, and I get what you're saying, and I also remember that lost video that came out soon after he died or right before he died, where he said, I try to get A players on the team.
Yeah.
Right. I don't, and he said in that video, A players want to work with A players, and C players want to work with C players. And my goal is to get the right people on the bus in the first place, something to that effect, right? So you got to get the right people on there. Talk about the chapter on listen for needs, not words.
Yeah. So this is one that I think is, well, I think where it applies most is with kids and also with ourselves. I don't even remember if I go directly into it in that chapter, but I was one of those leaders, and I don't think I'm alone, that I was always trying to solve people's problems. Like, how can I tell you what you did wrong? Or how can I kind of solve the problem for you? And there was this peace activist, psychologist turned peace activist named Marshall Rosenberg, and he had a little bit longer statement. I shortened it he said, listen for people's needs, not their words. And here I am like, hey, I haven't even figured out how to be a good listener yet, and now I got to listen for people's needs too.
Yeah, right.
And, but it was so powerful because, so like that person, the leader who's got a line outside his door, I was one of those. Like, well, what need are you filling by solving everyone's problems for them? What need are you filling in yourself? Is it like, I don't feel like I'm adding value? For me, I felt like, well, that's my value, is to, help people find the solutions. We do that in relationships, like with, I have like younger kids, age 10 and 12. And often employees or even kids don't have really language for needs. And so we have to so what's the need behind what they're saying? The person who talks a lot in meetings and always has to have the last word, like, well, what's the need that that they're meeting? Is it they don't feel appreciated? They don't feel respected? What is the need? And like when we're able to listen in that way, it helps us to see people in a new light.
I like that. When I worked with Tony Robbins many years ago, he taught me to focus on human needs. He would say, he said, there's X amount of human needs. In his world, it was 6 human needs. And everything a human being does, they do to satisfy one of those needs. And what I'm hearing you say is, as a leader, have those conversations, do a little find out, be curious in such a way to find out what their needs are, and then see if there's a way that you can help satisfy that need while driving business at the same time.
Yeah. And I think that this is another one where language gets in the way, is as leaders. And anyway, it was like, well, I need you to get that project done, or I need more appreciation from my boss. And Marshall Rosenberg talked about the Plato acronym. So whenever you say, I need, and that sentence includes a person, a location, a thing. So a need is, I need appreciation. It's like emotion. I feel blank. I need blank. There's only one more word. Now, one way to get appreciation is from my boss or from my spouse or from my parent, right? But that's just one strategy. So if I know that what I need more of is appreciation or autonomy or whatever it is, then I can say, well, what are some other strategies? This happens in marriages all the time. Like, oh, I need my husband or my wife to appreciate me more. Well, maybe that would be nice if they gave you more appreciation, but maybe you've got somebody else in your life who's just very, effusive with praise that you can get appreciation from. My father, one of our challenges in our relationship was that he never, even to this day, has never said, good job. And I'm like, wow, I built this great company. But one of the protege of Marshall Rosenberg says, look, you don't go to a hardware store looking for ice cream, do you? So
but I will, that is true. But at a hardware store, people do want good customer service.
Yes.
And that it is of itself a little bit of ice cream. Again, it goes back to a balance, right? So I work in an industry sometimes in the transportation industry with some companies where we have maybe some truck drivers and so forth. And when you think about these people, I know I can speak pretty straight up with these folks. They're salt of the earth. They're great people. They're used to people just calling a spade a spade.
Yeah.
But when I get on private calls with them and they're having me work with them, they too have feelings. Right. So we have to always keep that in mind, the feeling side of the experience that your people are having, because like you said, I mean, people work for a job, but they quit because of their first line boss, if you will. And so that first line boss needs to be aware of certain feelings and so forth. Not that we want people walking around saying, I want to feel more appreciated. You just need to know as a leader that there's a balance between expressing gratitude, appreciation, but also saying, hey, we're going to get that done on time, right? It's just a balance.
Yeah.
Later on, you talk about an autonomy raise is often more effective than a pay raise. The word I heard from, okay, no, go ahead, and then I might have something to say about that.
So this was ultimately the reason that I left my role as CEO. Most people don't think, well, CEOs are the boss, right? Well, we have shareholders that we report to.
That's right.
Or boards of directors. And ultimately my boss, even though he was not working in the business day to day, was our controlling shareholder, my father.
Yep.
And so I didn't feel like I had the autonomy. And so the autonomy raise is again, like all the tools in TalkShift, it's a specific conversation template.
Yep.
What I love about the autonomy raise is it's one of those things where there's a reverse talk shift. So some of these talk shifts I can use as a leader, right?
That is.
I can use as a leader with an employee to shift a relationship. So if I want to give someone more autonomy, then I have the question and say, hey, TJ, like on a scale of 1 to 10, how much autonomy do you feel that I'm granting you? And I give you an opportunity to respond. And then I say, well, what would be the difference between a 6 and a 9 for you? And we start to come up with some really concrete differences of what autonomy means. And the challenge is that most micromanagers, well, I would say almost all micromanagers actually don't realize they're the last ones to know they're a micromanager, right? Mm-hmm. And so having this conversation, just the act of saying to your key people, how much autonomy do you have, might be a surprise for some people. Like, wow, I thought you'd say 9 and you said 6. Mm. If I had had this conversation, or my father had had this conversation with me, I would have said a 4 and he would have said, well, I thought it was an 11. Like that alone is a problem.
Yep.
But the thing that I love about the autonomy raise and many of the other talk shifts is you can use it in reverse. If I'm an employee who feels that my boss is not giving me enough autonomy, I can go and I can say, hey, TJ, I'd like to have a conversation about autonomy. How much autonomy do you think on a scale of 1 to 10 that you're granting me? Mm-hmm. And then like, well, oh, you thought at 11. Well, actually for me, it's kind of like a 4. Could we have a conversation about maybe some things that we could start doing or stop doing that would maybe be a difference between a 4 and a 7 for me?
Yeah.
And so that was really like, I said that the talk shifts are tools to build better bosses and become one. And most people kind of perceive that as like, oh, well, I'm a leader, so I'm building better bosses in my organization or below me. But actually, it's not just about building better bosses. It's also about building better bosses out of your current one. Mm-hmm. So they're tools that you can use to essentially manage up, if you will, and shift. And that's where I think that the commonalities that I saw in terms of the kind of the power dynamics between a boss and an employee is what I saw is that those same things exist often in marriage. And sometimes it's the woman who has and often in marriage, it often actually alternates. Sometimes it's the woman in certain areas who has the power and the man feels subservient. And in other cases, it's the woman who feels unsafe. And so these power dynamics and using these talk shifts in the context of, well, how do I have difficult conversations that I'm afraid to have? Mm-hmm. And I always find, as a CEO, in fact, I kind of run in a lot of CEO circles. Like CEOs are always like, "Oh yeah, I'm completely fine with having difficult conversations." You're like, "Of course you are. You're not the one who's." But when CEOs get in a room and they're in like a CEO peer group, they're like often the last people who are like, "Whoa, I'm not gonna tell them about that blind spot that I see over and over and over again," because CEOs are just as bad at having difficult conversations as everyone else.
I'm going to read something here right on that point. Greg was only 22 years old, and he had been with the company for less than 6 months when he first disagreed with me. And you go through this story where he disagreed with you. And in the end, you say this: often employees believe that disagreeing with a boss or a leader can be a career limiting move. But in this instance, it was something that differentiated Greg over the years. I've shared this short story with employees hundreds of times. Why? Because a great way of telling people that it's safe to challenge me is to share a story about someone who did it and how it increased your respect for them. You write that in the book. I think that's a powerful thing. Most frontline workers are going to feel uncomfortable going to their boss to say, listen, this is what I'm thinking, or I don't agree with that strategy, or I see a potential issue with that plan that you've put together. I think the leaders have to encourage that.
Yeah.
And I think that's what you say here. And I think that leaders have to say, talk to me. I need to know. You said you didn't want to be around people that always told you yes. And that's the key for any leader, is allow people. And I've been fortunate over the years to work with some awesome leaders that actually created those cultures.
Yeah. So I would say, like, one of the phrases I love about the book is, I say, it's like, let's talk about our words, the ones we're saying and the ones we aren't. Yeah. Like one of those things those marriage counselors says, that like most relationships don't, and she said in the context of marriage, but I think it happens in business relationships as well. Most relationships don't end in violence. They end in silence. Like somebody just kind of checks out. And then, like, a year later, they're like, hey, I'm out. And they're like, oh, what are we going to do? Like, well, right. I've been out for like a year. I mean, the research shows in divorce context, it's usually 1 or 2 years before someone actually says I'm out. Same happens with employees, though, right? Yeah. So I think that this, we were talking earlier about this folly of strengths, and like, we focus, like, the most powerful thing, even more powerful than like asking people and doing like assessments to find our weaknesses. The most powerful thing a leader can do, or that you can do in a marriage or as a parent, is to create an environment where people proactively feel safe to actually tell you about your blind spots, right?
100%.
And so that was what the story about Greg was about. I had another leader who worked for me, and this is probably a year or two after I started as CEO. I flew over to Germany, and Germans are pretty direct to begin with, right? So I flew over, I did some kind of big presentation to the employees over there, and we went to dinner, and he goes, Krister, you're a great manager, but you're a terrible leader.
Oh, I did read that.
I was like, on one side, I was like, wow, that was tough to hear. But on the other side, I felt at least good, like, wow, I'm happy that I created an environment that he actually was okay telling me that.
That's right.
And so it's really important that, when our children, spouses, employees, anyone does something that takes the courage to do something courageous and tell us something that really could hurt us, that we immediately come back and say, wow, thank you. Come back the next day. Hey, you know what? When you said that to me yesterday, wow, I really appreciate that. Come back a week later. If you really want people to do that, call a meeting and say, you know what TJ told me the other day? He told me this thing. I was so shocked. I had no idea that I've been doing it. You've all been seeing it probably for a year or two, right? That's and they're powerful. Like, yeah. Yep. And so now you want people to tell you, call them out, raise them up, and show them. And now you're going to people are going to be like, well, I'm going to tell them those 5 things that I've been seeing about him too.
Krister, that is really well said. I think that's really powerful, that you need to encourage it as a leader. And I would just say, as a reminder, I know you're going to get this, audience that's listening to this, is when you do encourage it and then someone says something that strikes you a little bit odd, like from a frustration level, you've got to do everything in you to not get defensive over it.
Yeah.
To receive it. And so what I tell my people that have the tendency to get defensive, and we can see that in some of the work that we do, like there's certain people that have that tendency to get defensive faster than other people.
Yeah.
I coach them on how to be curious.
Yeah.
Rather than be defensive and then put a wall up.
Yeah.
Start asking questions. Find out more. Because you know what? That'll wake you up.
Well, I think the first, even before that, is sometimes we're so we immediately, no matter how comfortable you, it's like there's a fear that comes up. Like it hurts to hear stuff. They're like, oh my gosh, I've been doing that for years.
Yeah.
I had a funny story in Germany. It was 6 years after, working with Germans, that my girlfriend, who happened to be Austrian, said, oh, wow, I overheard you talking to one of your employees. You didn't really ask them to, after you gave them that task, you didn't really ask them to give you a little status update after 2 days, did you? I said, yeah, we do that. And like, that's how we lead people in the United States. We ask them for a little status update. She goes, oh, you don't want to do that with Germans. And I was like, oh, wow, I've been doing this. And I talked to one of the Germans. I said, you German managers don't do it that way? And they're like, oh, no, we've been hating like you following up with us. So we create these situations. And, when I first heard that, I was like uncomfortable. And I think before we even get curious, it's just to say, hey, thank you. Let me think about that. And can I talk to you about it tomorrow? Right?
Yes.
And I think that's sometimes that's the best way.
Yeah.
As soon as you start inviting feedback, just recognize that the best response in the moment is just to say, let me think about that and come back to you.
I would say that second, right? That second. The first response is what you said earlier, which is, thanks for sharing that with me. Yeah. Hey, listen, I'll get back to you tomorrow. Let me think about it. But hey, thanks for sharing that with me.
Yeah.
Right. And then
ask if somebody else, you've probably heard this as well, is if one person says something, is like a big thing about writing a book, right? If one person gives you a piece of feedback, then you file it away. If two people give you the same piece of feedback, then you say, I bet if I sell this book to 1 million people, there's going to be more than 2 people that are going to have that same piece of feedback.
That's exactly right. Yep. And that's good that you had a lot of people read your book and so forth, because in beta mode, right? Because I know Jack Canfield told me on my first book, I said, what's the best piece of advice you could give me? And he said, have 30 to 40 people read your book before you put it out there. And I did it, like you. Yeah. I did it. And I remember initially being a little bit like, what, you're questioning? But that's the way I see it. And they're like, nobody will understand the way you just painted that picture. You got to paint it differently. And that's the power of relationships. That's the power of people. And so we should embrace it, at least internalize it, and then decide how to move forward. Okay, I think we're coming down to a close here. I want to share the 3-word secret to inspiring people. But before we do that, we'll make that the ending. How can people get your book?
So the best place to get the book is from my website at talkshift.com, because there you can get the video book and the exclusive audio footage. Yeah. Mm-hmm. You can get the video book and exclusive audio footage that's not going to be available on Amazon. It's obviously available on Amazon if you want to buy it there as well. So that's really the best place to get it. Okay. So we'll make sure we put that link up. Anything else our audience should know about you, in terms of your services and those kinds of things? Well, if an organization is trying to do a talk shift like en masse, the best way to do that is with a keynote or kind of virtual. So that's one of the things that I do other than speaking. I do a little bit of coaching just to keep in touch with like what's happening in the business world. But, good. Mostly I'm trying to, and then the only thing I would say is that if some people are going to go into the book is like, hey, how can I use these to be better leaders? If your specific objective is to say, how can I improve or transform a relationship with a business partner, a child, a spouse, or a specific employee, then this video book is really going to be the best tool to do that, especially in the context of a family. And then that should be out, I would say, by the middle of November on talkshift.com. Got it. Okay, good. Talkshift.com. We'll make sure we put a link up. All right. One of the principles you say, the 3-word secret to inspiring people. Can I give those away or do you want to give them away? Go ahead. You tell me what you thought of that chapter. Okay. It's one of my favorites. The 3 words were do something inspiring. Did I get it right? Yes. Will you explain it? Give us a little teaser on it, will you? Well, so I don't actually reveal this in the book, but there's a story, Matthew Porter, a man who he was an entrepreneur, sold his company for a good chunk of money. And he ran a 104-mile ultra marathon. And this was 4 years after he was diagnosed with multiple sclerosis. Wow. What I don't reveal in the book is that Matthew Porter is actually one of my closest friends. It was just kind of a coincidence. And it was the day after he ran his 104-mile ultra marathon, inspired me to do an ultra marathon myself. I was like, wow, I've always been my entire life overweight. And I was like, well, if a guy with multiple sclerosis can run 104 miles, why can't I run a 50K, right? Wow. And it was amazing to see. I don't talk about this specific in the book, but to see someone, just when we think that things are going terribly, it was 104 miles. I saw him like every 10 or 15 miles. He had a rest stop. And at about mile 55, everyone on the crew was like, he's not going to make it to the next one. It was like 3 a.m. He just looked like he was going to stop any minute. And 15 miles later, you could have thought he was just starting. Like he was running like this. And so it happened to be a CEO that I was coaching by, we decided to do like a 27-mile hike over 4 mountains that was about 30 miles away from where Matthew did his 104-mile ultramarathon. And we had the same thing. It was like we get at the top of the mountain and I'd see the CEO and he was just like in a terrible mood. I was like, I think he's going to quit right now. And then he would run down the mountain. He would literally go from 15 minutes here to 15 minutes there to from like the lowest of lows looking like he's going to quit to like he's just like a little kid in a candy store running down the mountain. And it happened 4 times. And it just gave me so much like, just as we think we're going to quit, we could be 15 minutes away from like that endorphin high of, the opposite feeling.
That is a life principle right there. So don't give up. You're closer than you think many times. Yeah. So stay in the game. All right. Hey, Krister, it was awesome to have you on the podcast. And you know what? You did give some great tools here in the interview, but I also encourage everybody to go get his book, Talk Shifts. And there's specific tools in here that can help you communicate differently with your people, and that can affect your business, but also I hear you loud and clear, your personal relationships and more. So use these tools. They are fundamental principles that can change your life.
Yeah.
Krister.
They changed mine at least, and my relationship with my father. So it's I hope that I'm fairly confident that it will change a lot of other lives as well.
I agree. Thank you for being on the show.
Thank you for the invitation. I appreciate it.
You bet.